All right, welcome everyone to the Tonic Accord podcast. I'm your host Drew with the other host Alex. Him and I are both from Chapman University and have degrees in political science, work in various fields related to politics. And today we're going to be discussing a host of things from all the way from history to the modern day issues, including great political schisms. The political crisis going on in Haiti, as well as the political crises going on in Brazil, and also what the fire hose of falsehoods is and how that relates to modern politics in the United States. So to start us off, we're going to be taking a look at some honorable mentions of big schisms, right? Scenarios where you have a unified group that experiences a massive split and breaks off into, separate or, divulging groups. And often schisms like these have major political impacts, and we just want to highlight and look at some of these throughout history. So to start us off, Alex, what do you have as one of the schisms you want to take a look at today?
Hey, what's up, Drew? First off, good to be talking. Hope all is well. It is hot as hell up here still, so just trying to stay cool. But luckily, we are not boiling like certain animals that unfortunately have been dying in the Northwest. But anyways, schisms, interesting stuff. To me, kind of a schism is usually between like people, right, an organization, maybe politics, religious movements. And I'm going to start with one that's kind of relevant to the U.S. politics right now. And basically, like to generalize it, it is the 1970s and this weird schism that seemed to happen inside of the Republican Party that has kind of led to schisms now. And what I mean is that kind of in the post-World War II era, it seemed like kind of Republicans and Democrats were somewhat centrist, but just leaning like you had the Christian Democrats and kind of the establishment Republicans overlapping. I think there was kind of this shared connection between the Great War, the economy, and kind of working together and bipartisanship. And so it seemed like in the late 60s that kind of changed. And I'm reading a really good book right now called Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal by George Packer. And he basically talks about how kind of in the last year, we've seen that there are four Americas. He talks about free America, which is kind of that don't tread on me, all government's bad part. There's the smart America, kind of the well-educated class of high earners, the tech people, the coastal people, just kind of the city elites who work from home, especially during the pandemic. Then there's the real America, kind of what Sarah Palin categorized as white Christian nationalists. And then there's Just America, which is kind of that younger generation of people who believe that injustice is the heart of all the country's problems. And all of those are their own schisms in a way, but the Free America one is what I would say came out of the 70s, and I think it radicalized the Republican Party. And so what happened is, prior to the 1970s, a lot of the Republican establishment were college-educated elites. And there was a shift, and it was kind of that Southern strategy, Nixon era, Barry Goldwater era time where they adopted Frederich Hayek's views. And he was this Swiss-Austrian libertarian who basically viewed that all forms of government regulation inevitably lead to tyranny. So there's no point of having a good government. It's a little bit of anarchism, but it's mainly libertarianism. And that kind of came out of the 70s. That's why we saw people like Goldwater and other Southern Republicans reject the civil rights movement. They were segregationists. And they always would say, well, it's not the correct way to end this. I mean, it was obviously racist, but to them, they're like, well, any government programs, including civil rights, is not going to work. And this kind of fueled a working class revolt against kind of the establishment on both sides in a lot of ways. And it fueled also this hate for minorities and secularists and establishment wealthy people. And that just seemed to get worse and worse over time. And out of this era, we kind of had this view of like, I don't want government programs. I don't want to pay for government programs because they're going to help other people as well. And that was the big shift. And then, we got Reagan, who, even though he was kind of this, to evangelicals, he was this kind of culture warrior. He was really like owned by a lot of bankers, a lot of Wall Street financing. And he actually was kind of a deregulation, just like fiscal, good for big business, good for the wealthy, but bad for the working class. But somehow along that time, the Republican Party was able to shift that into low taxes, corporate cuts are good for the working people. And we kind of saw that just continue and continue, this like just distaste for government. And that I think kind of met fruition in the 90s with Newt Gingrich, like where he kind of turned it into a forever war. It was like politics is not about agreement. It's about just stalling the other side or stopping government. And that led to Ted Cruz and inevitably Trump as well. And, it's like it was never like policy. It was let's find another scapegoat. And yeah, I really think that was a really important schism inside of the Republican Party that really changed them for now as well.
So yeah, so that's what I wanted to pinpoint. So you think that it was a schism between Republicans against other Republicans, or
Yeah, yeah,
or
because
okay,
like prior to kind of this more libertarian "don't tread on me" movement in the 70s, it was kind of like Republicans were pretty pro-establishment, pro like infrastructure, for example. Right. I mean, we have to remember that Eisenhower was he was a Republican, but he also believed it. Yeah, exactly. And that was a big shift after kind of the Eisenhower era. And I think it's here to stay, like just this distaste for government and helping others, and just kind of like a lot of people that now support this movement have lost their status in society, but they're holding on to their freedoms and their liberty, and it's become kind of toxic liberty.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed like a lot of similar topics around this idea a bunch, and one is I definitely see what you're saying is like again like as far as like if you look at Republicans and Democrats in the 50s and maybe early 60s, ideologically they're not that far off, generally pro-capitalist, maybe differences in where where government says some things, but like you're right that like Ike built a ton of freeway systems, infrastructure, and as long as you weren't a communist in the 50s, there was a general trust that a Democrat or a Republican is a patriot that wants to see America do better. I think after the Vietnam War and the unsettling nature of the late 60s, and then certainly with Watergate and Reagan, I can see how what you're saying could be true, that after those things, a massive distrust in government from arguably good reasons to distrust government, a long war that led to nowhere, and a president that lied to the people, right? But coming out of that, becoming a larger monster, which is this ultra right-wing movement that is very anti like any federal government, and while you mentioned you had talked about how it tracks from politicians like Barry Goldwater all the way to Newt Gingrich, who really upped the ante as far as anti-establishment, anti-government, to the point of contrarianism almost, and how that led into Trump. I also think there's a through line with like the fringe movements as well as like the
Mm-hmm.
wake like the very pro, and I'm a pro Second Amendment guy, but not like I'm not gonna I'm not gonna fight DEA agents at my in a siege over it, right? And so you have these moments in the 70s like Waco, Texas, and the shootings in Oregon. I keep forgetting what that one was called. But all these like big Second Amendment rights moments with these shootouts with federal agents, Waco, Texas, the Oklahoma City bombing, and that really anti-federal government sentiment, that was fringe at the time, becomes more normalized, and I think is now accepted in circles like QAnon today. This notion that the government is not of your peers and other Americans with general do-gooding in their heart. Maybe they get things wrong, but it's not. But the idea is not the government is made up of peers. It's the idea that the government is made up of like shadowy figures that want to oppress and keep us down and have malintent, and that is now again, I think, the norm among some Republicans, or among most Republicans that support Trump. And yeah, I can see what you're saying and how it starts. It starts with the Republican rhetoric in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because if you didn't have Waco, I think was it Ruby Mountain? Was that the one where
Ruby
those
Ridge?
were?
Ruby Ridge.
Ruby Ridge. That's it. Yeah, I don't think we would have seen January 6th happen if those weren't predecessors. And we also wouldn't have seen Ruby Ridge happen or Waco happen without this newly defined idea that the government's bad, they're evil. Like we should stand up and rise against it. Don't tread on me, which is quite an old symbol from back during the times of the Revolutionary War. I mean, it was a rebellion thing. It was to say like tyranny and government's bad, and a lot of people have really taken that home, and it's
Yeah,
bad. It's
and
just bad.
you're right. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, like an overreaching, bloated government can stifle economic activity. That's one thing. That's a fair argument. But then there's the other idea that I think what you're getting at is what really holds root is just this cultural disposition against government in general,
Yeah.
and that I think is harmful because then you have scenarios where, like, again, the coronavirus, where we're like, guys, this is exactly the scenario where we need government when it's a public health crisis, and people have such a distrust based because of the things we're talking about, the decades of things, of events and rhetoric we're talking about, that has people so divided. And I think that's a good one to bring up. It's almost a hidden schism in the American public of those that just will never trust government of any kind, and those that maybe see it as something more malleable.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's very well put. For you, what's on your radar?
Well, mine is a little more obvious, and less hidden underneath some nice nuance, like yours. But mine is
Well, good. We need those.
the Great Schism, and this is the schism in the Christian Church, in about 1054. That led to the creation of the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But the reason I bring it up is for a few things. Is one is it is a has a lot of reverberations past the event. In 1054, the schism happened where the Western Pope decided to try to excommunicate some of the top patriarchs of the Eastern churches. At the time, they were still buddy buddy, but they had these different structures. And when they tried to excommunicate each other, it completely broke down. And so I bring it up because after that, we see, a schism that lasts for hundreds of years with the religion and the religious structures involved in Europe, right? The Catholic Church dominating Western Europe, the Eastern Orthodox Church dominating culture and religion in Eastern Europe. There's cultural divides still today along those religious lines. Um, Religious wars fought on the fringes of these borders. And then on top of that, I think it's important to look at it from before the event happened, because it happened in 1054 when the excommunications between the two churches happened, but they all got pissed. But the reason I bring it up is because it actually had about 1,000 years of little tiny things. It was almost death by 1,000 cuts, the relationship between these two churches. Because again, before this schism, really there was one church. Obviously there had been maybe tiny, small Christian sects during the Roman era when they were being persecuted. But once Christianity was the dominant religion in Europe, there was a church, and for hundreds of years, and it was things like the Eastern and Western churches disagreeing on what type of bread to use when taking communion, all the way up to things like how they wrote things out in like councils on deciding what interpretations of the Bible. The Western, and they would come to an agreement that it was the Father, the Son that gave, and they got their power from the Holy Spirit. But then they would have debates of, oh no, they didn't get their power from the Holy Spirit, they got their power with the Holy Spirit, right? Think like little interpretations that might seem trivial to us today, but at the time were cruxes of belief for these different peoples. And then these little disagreements, over time, led to, full-blown attempts at excommunicating the other leader out of their churches. And when you have kings from multiple nation states, or I guess not nation states at the time, but kingdoms, being like taking orders from the Pope to full-on crusade against the East, the Middle East, it is important on what church is in power. Along, even a part of the Crusades, Western Christians were ransacking and looting Eastern churches at first because of this divide. And so at some point, the church said, no, 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 stop crusading against Christians, even though they're the wrong type of Christians. You need to crusade against the Muslims, right? So the divide was very strong. And I bring it up because there was 1,000 years before of the schism that is important to understand the context, and then there's 1,000 years after that it has ripples effect through history. So certainly a great schism earns its name. And even though if you're out there and you don't know much about it or are not Christian, I still encourage you to look it up and learn some more because it shapes a lot of our history.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you brought that one up because it does define almost everything that's happened since then. And there's something like for me, like I don't know much. Like I am very dumb when it comes to religion. I'll be completely honest with that. But what I do know inside of Rome during that time, like right before the actual fall of Rome, but inside of the Roman Empire and in their like neighboring territories, their conquered lands, there was a xenophobia that was growing towards the end where they didn't seem to see the forest through the trees, where the Roman Empire was wealthy and could get, turmeric in their tea because they'd conquered parts of the Far East. And they'd also been into the UK and Spain and France, and they didn't seem to understand that the reason why they had so much wealth was because of their conquests and the immigrants that came back because of it. And towards the end, the Romans got paranoid and xenophobic. And I think part of the reason why there was this great schism that happened over time was because when a lot of the Roman elites went to, Constantinople in the Byzantine side, like Eastern Rome, as some would call it, it really showed this like superiority was collapsing in the West. And there was this strong Roman ideal of like Rome is the best, the Latin culture is the best. And now all of a sudden you have Slavs and Greeks speaking different languages with now the wealth that used to be in Rome that's now in Constantinople. And I just have to think that there was also just that cultural xenophobic paranoia that probably led the Roman Catholic Church to go towards this. And it's just kind of interesting to see because this was at one time a vast empire that literally broke in half in some ways. And, the eastern half did last a lot longer than the western half. And I don't think a lot of people at the time thought that was going to happen. And again, also it's super important because this was the first time, like you said, and I thought you said it really well, was that, yeah, there were probably a few little sects of Christians that maybe believed something different. But once the Roman Empire had full, superiority in Rome, the Roman Catholic Church had superiority in Rome, there was no dissent. It was kind of what the Roman Church believed. And, I don't think the Reformation, which happened, 500 years later, I don't think that would have happened if we didn't see this first breakup. Because now, obviously, man, we have so many denominations of Christianity, it's insane. And none of those probably would have happened unless this great breakup happened.
Yeah, and they tried. They literally tried things to avoid this. The Council of Nicaea, and there's a couple of those, is when they had all the leaders of the main churches, East and West, trying to get together and like decide, okay, what do we actually believe in the Bible? And those councils is where a lot of these contentions came bubbling up, is because the Eastern folks would say, well, this is what we believe, and then the Western folks would say, well, no, that's not what we believe. This is what we believe. And so anytime those councils happened, when they tried to agree upon a doctrine, some people weren't happy, of course, right? Big surprise. And then also to your point about discrimination and airs of superiority, that definitely happened. When looking at the Great Schism, again, for years before, various leaders in the West and in the Byzantine lands were like, they were banning the languages used by the other church. So they wouldn't say, well, we're not banning the church, we're not banning Western churches, because there wasn't really a definition of that. But they were like, but if you're in Byzantine area, your church can only speak Greek. And if you're in the Roman area, your church can only speak Latin. And when that happened, because there was, of course, crossover, there was people, with more Western-oriented churches in the East, and vice versa. When they started banning languages of stuff, is when the heat really got put on the problem. Now people were like, I literally can't interpret my religion because you didn't ban the religion, but you banned the use of the language that my religion is based out of. And it was an obvious discrimination against the West or East, and both sides did it. And yes, and you're right that idea that Romans didn't want Constantinople, modern day Istanbul, to be better than them. There was absolutely a competition between Constantinople and Rome to be the most holy city. And that's why they both have lavish churches and a lot of stuff like that, and murals and artifacts, because they were trying to one up each other for a while.
Yeah, it's kind of wild because like the funny thing is that by the time Constantinople was like at its true like glory, Rome was crumbling. Like there's a reason why the Goths from the north were able to just like trample Rome basically. I mean, they sacked it I think like 4 times, and that final sack, I mean, the people basically just bent over. You know, it's I mean, Rome was crumbling, and part of me feels like it was that, you know, Napoleon complex, that paranoid ego that was like, well, this is our final thing, maybe at least the legacy of the Roman Catholic Church. And you know, it's just interesting to see, because obviously this also paved the way for the Dark Ages in a lot of ways too.
Right.
Just because, I mean, I mean, as an agnostic myself, like I kind of wish Rome I kind of wish Rome actually never went down the road of being dominated by the Roman Catholic Church, because I think their pagan days is when some of their best ideas and art came out of.
Dude, yeah, those pagan albums are way better than the Christian albums.
Dude, yeah, once they made that transition, hell no. Another quick one I have on this schism thing is the Spanish Civil War. You know, it's something that I think could almost like culminate with the Spanish Civil War, but it also was the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, Karl Marx. It was like the Spanish Civil War, I think, was just another part of that. And the reason why I think it's so important is, well, I mean, I was just in Spain, so I saw like kind of the crumbles and the shadows that are still there from this. But basically, like, Spain was, you know, had been an empire. There was a saying that was like, the sun never sets in Spain, because of how big the empire was at their glory. But by the by the 20th century, Spain was a destitute and just struggling country. It was kind of like Rome prior to the Great Schism. And unfortunately, there was also the tides of Bolshevism and the tides of fascism that were hitting the coast of Spain. And there was a lot of poverty, a lot of anger, and a lot of lost culture. And the Spanish Civil War erupted very fast. And you had the workers mainly, you know, the unions, the communists, the peasants, who all kind of aligned with Bolshevik Russia, and they were receiving aid from Russia. And at the same time, you had the landlords, you had the bourgeoisie and the upper classes, usually Catholics. And the war was bloody, man. It turned kind of the center of the country in the Madrid area against kind of these other territories that had different cultures. I mean, the Basque Country, Catalonia, Andalusia, they just got destroyed in a lot of times by the central nationalist Catholic crown government. And there were bad people on both sides. There were really bad people on both sides, because the issue was that the war just became entrenched. It was like, well, I'd rather be siding with the violent Bolsheviks than with the violent fascists, basically. And a lot of people died. A lot of people had friends and family on different sides of the conflict. And they're still digging up mass graves to this day in Valencia, which is in the east. And it was something that I think really brought out the growing division prior to World War II in a lot of ways. And I mean, I was in Spain the last three and a half years, and I mean, you still see it today, and that's why I think it's so important. Is, I mean, I lived in Madrid, which was where Franco's residence was. I've been to Franco's residence. I lived near Franco's old residence, and I went to Valle de los Caídos one day, which is where he was buried until recently. They finally moved his body. But people would go there. I went there because I think history is important to remember. But other people went there to cry at his grave. The elite wealthy of Madrid, the more right-leaning Catholics, they still think he did a good job. You know, I mean, he did improve the infrastructure of Spain, but it took killing the other side, killing the opposition, and allying with Hitler to do so. And it's an interesting legacy. I mean, they've tried to move on. They've tried to reconcile with the past. They passed a bill in the late 80s that basically said we're going to forgive, and move on. And in some ways it worked. I think it was necessary. But there's still a lot of ghosts in Spain. And, you know, George Orwell wrote about it in Homage to Catalonia. And he says his 1984 writings later on were influenced by just the violence and treachery that happened in Spain.